Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you'd like, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. The Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets. What if the bones were too big to explain? Picture this: a team of excavators in Ohio, 1879, uncovering a burial mound. The dig proceeds normally until they reach the central chamber. There, arranged in ceremonial position, lies a skeleton. But something is wrong. The femur is too long. The skull is too large. The ribs extend far beyond normal human proportions. The team measures carefully, they document everything, they contact the Smithsonian Institution, America's premier scientific authority. Representatives arrive. They examine the remains. They carefully pack everything into crates. The crates are loaded onto wagons, then trains. They disappear into the vaults of the nation's most trusted museum. And then, according to some researchers, those bones are never seen again. This is the central allegation that has haunted the Smithsonian Institution for over a century. Not a single dramatic cover-up, but a pattern. A systematic removal of evidence that challenges our understanding of the past. Artifacts that don't fit the established narrative, quietly set aside. Discoveries that raise uncomfortable questions, lost in bureaucratic shadows. The Smithsonian Institution stands as the world's largest museum and research complex. 19 museums, 9 research centres, 140 million artefacts and specimens. It defines American history for generations of schoolchildren. It shapes our collective memory of who we were and how we came to be. Millions walk through its halls each year. They stand before dinosaur skeletons and moon rocks. They examine the Wright brothers' flyer and the Star-Spangled Banner. They trust that what they see represents the complete story of human achievement and natural history. But what if some discoveries never made it to the display cases? What if the story we've been told is incomplete? Not because of malicious conspiracy, but because institutions, like people, sometimes choose comfort over confrontation. Tonight, we examine the allegations. We follow the paper trails. We explore the missing artifacts, the vanished records, and the persistent claims that history has been edited before reaching our eyes. We'll hear from believers and skeptics. We'll examine evidence and counter-evidence. We'll ask uncomfortable questions about the institutions we trust to preserve truth. This is the story of the Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets, a story that begins not with malice, but with money, not with conspiracy, but with a gift that would change American science forever. Chapter 1: The Rise of an Authority. The Smithsonian Institution was born from the will of an Englishman who never visited America. James Smithson, a British scientist and mineralogist, died in 1829 in Genoa, Italy. His life had been devoted to scientific inquiry. He published 27 papers on chemistry and geology. He travelled throughout Europe collecting mineral specimens. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of the most prestigious scientific organisations in the world. But Smithson harboured a resentment. He was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Northumberland. Though brilliant, he could never inherit his father's title or estate. British society, for all its scientific advancement, still judged men by birth rather than merit. Perhaps that's why his will contained such an extraordinary clause. If his nephew, Henry, James Hungerford, died without heirs, Smithson's entire estate would go to the United States government. The purpose: to found at Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Why America? Smithson never explained. He never visited the country. He had no known American connections. But he saw in the young republic something Britain lacked: the promise of meritocracy, a place where knowledge mattered more than lineage. The nephew died childless in 1835. The inheritance worth over $500,000 in gold sovereigns became available. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to well over $10 million today. But Congress hesitated. Should the United States accept a gift from a foreign citizen? What strings might be attached? What would this institution actually do? Debate raged for nearly a decade. Some wanted a national university, others proposed an observatory, a library, or a museum. Former President John Quincy Adams, then serving in Congress, championed the cause. He argued that accepting Smithson's gift was a matter of national honour. Finally, in 1846, President James Polk signed the act establishing the Smithsonian Institution. The legislation was deliberately vague about the institution's specific mission. It would promote knowledge. The details would evolve. Joseph Henry, a renowned physicist, became the first secretary. He envisioned the Smithsonian primarily as a research institution, not a museum. He wanted to fund original scientific investigation and publish findings. He was less interested in collecting objects, but the building itself suggested otherwise. Architect James Renwick designed a castle in red sandstone, with towers and crenellations evoking medieval fortresses of knowledge. It looked like a place to house treasures, not just conduct research. From the beginning, the Smithsonian faced a fundamental tension. Would it be a research institute or a museum? Would it generate new knowledge or preserve existing discoveries? The answer became both. And in trying to be both, it accumulated power. The timing was perfect. America in the mid-1800s was experiencing an explosion of archaeological discoveries. As the frontier expanded westward, as railroads cut through previously unmapped territory, as settlers ploughed fields and built foundations, they encountered evidence of ancient habitation. Burial mounds dotted the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Earthworks of staggering scale emerged from forests being cleared for farmland. Artifacts surfaced. Copper tools, shell beads, stone carvings, ceramic vessels. Who made these? The question consumed popular imagination. Native American tribes had oral histories about some sites, but the sheer scale of certain earthworks seemed beyond what small tribal groups could accomplish. Also, white Americans reasoned bringing their own biases to interpretation. The Smithsonian positioned itself as the authority on these questions. It dispatched researchers across the expanding nation. It collected specimens by the thousands. It established protocols for excavation and preservation. It decided what was scientifically significant and what was mere curiosity. Cyrus Thomas, employed by the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, beginning in 1882, led extensive surveys of ancient mounds throughout the eastern United States. His mission was clear: determine who built the earthworks that puzzled settlers and scientists alike. Thomas was methodical. He visited hundreds of sites. He supervised excavations. He catalogued thousands of artifacts. He reviewed every account, every theory, every wild speculation about ancient builders. His conclusion, published in 1894 in a massive report, became institutional orthodoxy. The mounds were built by ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes, not by a separate vanished race. There were no lost civilizations, no mysterious mound builders. The engineering and labour were entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. This was actually progressive for its time. It countered racist theories that Native Americans were too primitive to have built such structures. It acknowledged indigenous achievement and continuity. But it also established a pattern. The Smithsonian would define the boundaries of acceptable history. It would determine what theories deserved consideration and what theories were pseudoscience. It would decide which artifacts merited preservation and which could be discarded as unimportant. And with authority comes power. The power to decide what is remembered. The power to choose what is forgotten. The power to shape collective memory. By the early 20th century, the Smithsonian had become the central repository for American archaeology. If you discovered something significant, you contacted the Smithsonian. If you wanted funding for excavation, you needed Smithsonian approval. If you hoped to publish findings in respected journals, you needed Smithsonian endorsement. This centralization had benefits. It prevented duplication of effort, It raised standards for archaeological practice. It protected sites from amateur looters. But it also created vulnerability. A single institution now controlled access to much of the physical evidence of America's past. And if that institution had blind spots, biases, or reasons to avoid certain questions, there were few checks on its authority. The conspiracy theories that would haunt the institution for the next century were already taking root. Because as the Smithsonian accumulated artefacts by the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, questions arose that have never been satisfactorily answered. What happened to everything they collected? Where did it all go? How were decisions made about what to study, what to display, what to store, and what to quietly remove from consideration? And if something challenged their conclusions, would they have any incentive to share it? Or would the easier path be to set it aside, catalogue it vaguely, and let it disappear into the vast collections where few would ever look? These weren't unreasonable questions then. They aren't unreasonable now. Chapter 2. The Giant Skeleton Claims. The newspaper accounts are extensive and surprisingly consistent. The New York Times, November 10th, 1880, page 5. A giant's bones. The body of a man 11 feet 4 inches high discovered near Middletown, Ohio. The San Diego Union, August 5th, 1877. Front page. Remains of giants unearthed. Skeletons of extraordinary size found in California burial mounds. The Indianapolis News, November 10th, 1875. Remains of gigantic size disinterred near Greencastle. The skeleton measured 8 feet from crown to heel. The Worthington, Advance, Minnesota, May 10th, 1888. A giant's bones unearthed. Remains measuring 9 feet in length found during excavation of Indian mound. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar reports appear in newspapers across America between 1850 and 1920. They describe the discovery of human skeletons measuring 7, 8, 9, even 10 feet tall, often found in burial mounds, frequently accompanied by copper tools, shell beads, and other artifacts suggesting ceremonial burial. The reports follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Local excavators, often farmers or construction workers, make a discovery while digging. They recognise the bones as human but note unusual size. They contact local authorities or newspapers. The story's published. Scientists or museum representatives are contacted. The remains are measured, documented and packed for transportation to institutions like the Smithsonian for further study. And then, according to conspiracy theorists, the trail goes cold. Researchers today who try to locate these skeletons in Smithsonian collections claim they cannot find them. The catalogue numbers don't match existing records. The accession documents are incomplete or missing. The specimens have been deaccessioned or lost in transfer, or simply cannot be located despite extensive searching. Let's examine a specific case in detail. In May of 1897, the Times of London reported on excavations in Lovelock Cave, Nevada. The site yielded numerous artefacts and skeletal remains. According to reports, some of the skeletons measured significantly above normal human height ranges. The tallest supposedly measured 8 feet, 4 inches. The excavation was supervised by James Hart Mercer, an archaeologist who worked with the Smithsonian. His field notes, which still exist in archives, describe skeletal material of unusual dimensions. He arranged for the remains to be shipped to Washington for analysis. Modern researchers seeking these specific bones have been unable to locate them in Smithsonian collections. The institution acknowledges receiving materials from Lovelock Cave, but the catalogue descriptions don't match Mercer's field notes. Heights listed are within normal ranges. The unusually large specimens are absent. What happened? 3 possibilities. First, the measurements were wrong. Mercer was working in difficult conditions. Bones were fragmentary. He might have misassembled remains or measured incorrectly. Second, the bones were misidentified. Large animal bones were mistaken for human remains. This happened frequently in early archaeology. Third, the bones existed as described but have since been lost, destroyed, or deliberately removed from the collection. The conspiracy theory embraces the third explanation, but the first two are more probable, and yet the pattern repeats across dozens of cases. The most famous allegation involves a Supreme Court case that never actually happened. In 2005, a story began circulating online. It claimed the Smithsonian institution had been sued in federal court for destroying evidence of giant skeletons. The supposed lawsuit was filed by the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The court allegedly ruled in favour of the plaintiffs, ordering the Smithsonian to release classified documents proving the institution had destroyed tens of thousands of giant human remains in the early 1900s. The story was elaborate. It included fake quotes from Smithsonian officials admitting the destruction. It referenced specific case numbers and court dates. It spread rapidly through conspiracy theory websites and social media. Except none of this happened. There is no such court case, no ruling, no American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The entire story was a fabrication, created by a satirical website and then taken seriously by people who wanted to believe it. When confronted with the hoax, true believers didn't abandon the theory. They claimed the debunking itself was part of the cover-up. The fact that no evidence existed for the lawsuit proved how powerful the conspiracy was. But the fabricated lawsuit built on a foundation of genuine mystery. Because those 19th century newspaper reports are real, they exist in archives. You can read them yourself in digitized historical newspaper collections. So what explains them? The official position is straightforward and, honestly, pretty convincing. Early American archaeology was chaotic and unscientific. Professional archaeology didn't really exist as a discipline. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs. Measurements were inaccurate, standards for documentation didn't exist. Giants were actually normal skeletons that appeared larger due to several factors. Soil displacement and geological pressure could spread bones apart, making them seem larger than life size. Decomposition and mineralization could cause bones to expand. Enthusiastic local boosters exaggerated findings to attract attention and tourists. Newspapers of that era printed sensational stories without rigorous verification. If a farmer claimed he found giant bones, the local paper might print it without investigation. Some cases have clear, documented explanations. A giant skeleton discovered in New York in 1871 turned out to be a mastodon. The initial report described it as human before expert examination revealed the truth. The mysterious 7-foot skull found in Missouri in 1894 was from a cave bear. The finder genuinely believed it was human. Only later analysis corrected the identification. The Cardiff giant, perhaps the most famous giant of the era, was an outright hoax. A 10-foot-tall stone figure uncovered in New York in 1869. Thousands paid to see it. Scientists from Yale examined it. Some declared it proof of ancient giants mentioned in the Bible. It was eventually revealed as a carved gypsum statue, created by an atheist named George Hull specifically to mock biblical literalism. But not before making its creator thousands of dollars and fooling numerous educated people. If educated scientists could be fooled by an obvious fake carved from soft stone, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misidentify unusual animal bones? But not all reports fit this explanation. Some described skeletons excavated by trained observers. Some included multiple independent witnesses. Some were documented by reputable scientists of the era who should have known the difference between human and animal remains. In 1891, Professor Thomas Wilson of the Smithsonian's Department of Prehistoric Anthropology wrote about excavations in Ohio. His report mentioned human remains of extraordinary stature found in association with clearly human artifacts. Wilson was a trained anthropologist. He wasn't likely to confuse a mastodon with a human. What happened to the remains he described? They should be in the collection. The catalogue numbers exist, but the specimens cannot be found. The conspiracy theory asks a simple question. If even a handful of these reports were accurate, if humans significantly taller than normal once lived in North America, what happened to the evidence? And the answer conspiracy theorists arrive at is equally simple. The Smithsonian made it disappear, not because of malice, not because of some grand plan, but because these remains didn't fit the accepted narrative of human development. They raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. They complicated the story the institution was tasked with telling, so they were set aside, catalogued vaguely, stored in boxes that nobody opened, and over decades they were simply lost in the vast holdings of an ever-growing collection. Is this what happened? We can't know for certain, but the gaps in the record remain, and gaps, once noticed, are hard to ignore. Chapter 3. Missing Artifacts and Vanished Records. In 1991, a researcher named Vine Deloria Jr. published a book called Red Earth, White Lies, Native Americans and the Myth of Scientific Fact. Deloria was a Standing Rock Sioux, author, theologian, historian and activist. He held degrees from Iowa State, the Lutheran School of Theology, and a law degree from the University of Colorado. He wasn't a fringe conspiracy theorist. He was a serious scholar with legitimate credentials. His book challenged conventional archaeology on multiple fronts. But one chapter focused specifically on the Smithsonian Institution. He claimed the institution had a pattern of losing or discarding artifacts that didn't fit accepted timelines for human habitation in the Americas. Deloria cited specific examples. Stone tools found in geological layers at Hueyatlaco, Mexico, supposedly too old for human presence in the Americas. The tools existed, the excavation was professional, but the implications were so disruptive to accepted chronology that the findings were marginalized. Carved figurines from Nampa, Idaho, depicting extinct animals that humans weren't supposed to have encountered. The figurines were genuine artifacts, but they were found in geological contexts that suggested impossible antiquity. Rather than forcing reconsideration of timelines, they were labelled as somehow displaced or contaminated. Metal objects from cultures that supposedly hadn't developed metallurgy. Copper axes, bronze implements, iron tools found in contexts that predated when these technologies were supposed to exist in the Americas. Deloria's claim wasn't that the Smithsonian was maliciously destroying evidence. His argument was more subtle and in some ways more damning. He suggested the institution had become so invested in a particular narrative of American prehistory that it couldn't accommodate evidence that challenged that narrative. Artifacts that fit the story were carefully preserved, studied and displayed. Artifacts that didn't fit were treated with skepticism, catalogued vaguely, stored in less accessible locations and gradually forgotten. He cited excavation reports that referenced artifacts no longer in collections, catalogue numbers that led nowhere, requests to examine specimens that were denied or redirected to different materials entirely. Other researchers echoed these concerns. They pointed to early 20th century expedition reports that described remarkable finds that should have revolutionized understanding of ancient America. But the artifacts described in those reports couldn't be located in current collections. An 1897 expedition to Tennessee Mounds, led by Smithsonian archaeologists, documented in their field report the discovery of unusual metallurgical specimens showing evidence of smelting techniques not previously documented in Eastern Woodlands cultures. The catalogue, numbers assigned to these items, still exist in the archives, but the items themselves cannot be found. A 1913 field notebook from an Arkansas excavation describes carved stones bearing undeciphered symbols suggesting organised writing system. The notebook is carefully preserved in the Smithsonian archives. Researchers can read the detailed descriptions, view the hand-drawn sketches of the symbols, but the stones themselves are not in the collection. An 1884 letter from a Smithsonian curator to a colleague mentions receiving skeletal material of unusual proportions, requiring further anatomical study. No follow-up correspondence exists. No study was published. The specimens are not listed in current catalogues. Are these innocent casualties of time and institutional change? Almost certainly some are. The Smithsonian has experienced fires, floods and relocations. Materials have been damaged or destroyed through accident rather than intent. Early cataloguing systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes accessioned under descriptions that don't match current search terms. Storage facilities have changed. Collections have been reorganised multiple times. All of this creates natural gaps in institutional memory. but the pattern of gaps surrounding specifically anomalous artifacts is striking. Items that would have been controversial, that challenged accepted theories, seem disproportionately likely to be among the lost. The Smithsonian's response has been consistent. Early archaeological practice was poor. Documentation was incomplete. Many early excavations were conducted by amateurs who made claims without proper evidence. Items were sometimes accessioned based on donor descriptions that later proved inaccurate or exaggerated. When the institution couldn't verify the provenance or authenticity of an artifact, it was de-accessioned. This wasn't conspiracy. It was responsible museum practice. Museums cannot keep everything. Decisions must be made about what merits preservation and what doesn't. But critics point out an uncomfortable reality. Who decides what can be verified? What standards of evidence are applied? And if an artifact challenges fundamental assumptions about the past, might there be unconscious bias in how rigorously it's examined? If a stone arrowhead is found and donated, it's probably accepted with minimal scrutiny. It fits what we expect. But if a complex mechanism is found in an ancient context, might it face higher standards of proof? Might researchers look harder for reasons to dismiss it? This is the insidious nature of confirmation bias. It's not deliberate dishonesty. It's the human tendency to accept evidence that confirms existing beliefs and scrutinize evidence that challenges them. The deeper researchers dig into Smithsonian records, the more gaps they find. And these aren't just random gaps. They cluster around specific types of claims, evidence of human presence in the America's earlier than accepted timelines, evidence of technological sophistication in cultures deemed primitive, evidence of anatomical variation in ancient human populations, evidence of cultural achievements that challenge narratives of linear progress. Each individual gap might have an innocent explanation, but the pattern of gaps creates suspicion, and once that suspicion exists, absence of evidence becomes its own kind of proof. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, why can't they produce the artifacts described in their own historical records? Why aren't the specimens mentioned in century-old expedition reports available for modern analysis with advanced techniques? The official answer remains: they probably never existed as described, or they weren't what people thought they were, or they were lost through ordinary institutional processes over more than a century of operations. But conspiracy theorists hear a different message. They did exist. They were exactly what people thought, and now they're conveniently gone. Chapter 4. Advanced Ancient Knowledge. The stone walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru fit together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Some blocks weigh over 200 tons. They were somehow transported miles from quarries, lifted into position, and cut with such accuracy that no mortar was needed. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,500 years. Its base is level to within less than an inch. Its sides align almost perfectly with true north. The interior passages demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off Greece in 1901, contains gear systems and astronomical calculations that wouldn't appear again in European technology for over a millennium. It predicted solar eclipses, tracked planetary movements, and calculated the Olympic Games cycle. Ancient civilizations achieved things that challenge our understanding of their capabilities. This is not conspiracy theory. This is established fact, acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. But the question becomes, how much more advanced were they than we acknowledge? And more importantly, what evidence of that advancement has been minimized, overlooked, or deliberately ignored because it doesn't fit comfortable narratives of gradual technological progress? Some conspiracy theorists claim the Smithsonian has actively downplayed evidence of technological sophistication in ancient cultures, particularly in the Americas. The allegation isn't that ancient people had computers or aircraft. It's more subtle and, honestly, more plausible. The claim is that evidence of advanced knowledge, precision engineering, and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy has been systematically minimized to maintain a narrative of gradual, linear progress from primitive to advanced. The favourite model in mainstream archaeology is evolutionary. Hunter-gatherers become farmers. Farmers build villages. Villages become cities. Cities develop writing. Writing enables mathematics. Mathematics enables engineering. Each step follows predictably, logically, from the last. It's a comforting narrative. It suggests progress is inevitable. It implies our current civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement. But what if the pattern wasn't so linear? What if ancient people understood principles we think they couldn't have grasped? What if technological knowledge was sometimes lost rather than continuously accumulated? Conspiracy theorists point to specific examples that trouble mainstream explanations. The Piri-Reis map of 1513 shows coastal details of South America with remarkable accuracy. More controversially, it appears to show coastline features of Antarctica that wouldn't be mapped by modern explorers until centuries later. The map's creator, Ottoman Admiral Piri-Reis, claimed he based it on much older source maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great. How did ancient cartographers map Antarctica? The conventional answer: they didn't. The map shows South America's coast, and the Antarctic portion is misidentified coastline or pure fabrication. But the accuracy of other portions of the map makes this explanation less satisfying. The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq in 1936, consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, it generates small electric current. It dates to approximately 2,000 years ago. Was this actually a battery, or just a scroll container that happens to generate current as a side effect? Mainstream archaeology favours the latter, but experimental archaeology has shown these devices could effectively electroplate objects. Did ancient metallurgists understand principles of electrochemistry? Precision-drilled holes in granite at ancient Egyptian sites show characteristics that modern engineers associate with high-speed drilling equipment. The holes are perfectly circular, maintain consistent diameter through hard stone, and show spiral grooves suggesting rapid rotation. Conventional archaeology argues they were made with copper tools and sand abrasive, through patient application of rotational pressure. But experimental attempts to replicate these holes using proposed ancient methods have struggled to match the precision and speed suggested by the archaeological evidence. The Smithsonian's position on these artifacts is carefully calibrated. The institution acknowledges the sophistication. It marvels at ancient ingenuity. Its exhibits celebrate the achievements of past civilizations. But it argues these achievements are explainable within the bounds of known, ancient technology and knowledge. The Piri-Reis map drew on older sources, but those sources were medieval or classical, not impossibly ancient. The Baghdad battery might have been used for electroplating, but this doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. The Egyptian drillings were accomplished through techniques we haven't fully rediscovered, but that doesn't mean they required advanced technology. The conspiracy theorist argues, but what if we're underestimating these civilizations not because of evidence, but because we're committed to a particular narrative of human development? What if our models of technological progress are oversimplified? What if we've set the bar for ancient achievement artificially low, then use that lowered bar to dismiss evidence that exceeds it? Consider a specific case that illustrates this tension. In 1964, geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre was part of a team dating artifacts from Huatlaco, Mexico. They used multiple dating methods: uranium series, tetrahydration, and stratigraphic analysis. All methods consistently indicated the tools were over 250,000 years old. This created an obvious problem. Anatomically, modern humans weren't supposed to exist 250,000 years ago, let alone in the Americas. The accepted timeline for human migration to the Americas was roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. Steen McIntyre's findings, if accurate, would demolish that timeline. They would require complete reconsideration of human evolution and migration patterns. Her findings were rejected. Papers were refused publication. Colleagues distanced themselves. Her career suffered significantly. She later claimed she experienced direct institutional pressure from organisations including the Smithsonian. Pressure to reinterpret the data. Suggestions that her dating methods must be flawed. implications that publishing such findings would damage her professional reputation. Was this conspiracy, or was it simply the scientific process working as intended, subjecting extraordinary claims to extraordinary scrutiny? The line between healthy skepticism and close-minded orthodoxy is extremely thin, and institutions like the Smithsonian, which help define where that line falls, hold enormous power over what becomes accepted knowledge. Steen McIntyre's work remains controversial. Some researchers argue her dating methods were sound, and archaeology needs to reconsider timelines. Others maintain the dates must be incorrect because they conflict with overwhelming evidence from other fields. But notice what happened. The evidence wasn't destroyed, it wasn't hidden, it was questioned, criticised, and largely dismissed. The artefacts still exist, but they've been relegated to anomaly status. They don't appear in textbooks. They don't inform the standard narrative taught to students. This is a subtler form of information control than physical destruction of artefacts. It's the power to decide what evidence matters, what deserves attention, what merits inclusion in the official story. And that power, exercised over decades by institutions like the Smithsonian, shapes our entire understanding of the past. Chapter 5. Indigenous History and Narrative Control. The Mound Builder myth was one of 19th century America's most destructive historical frauds, and one with lasting consequences. It went like this. The impressive earthworks and burial mounds throughout the eastern United States were too sophisticated, too large, too precisely engineered to have been built by Native Americans. They must have been constructed by a separate, vanished race of mound builders who possessed advanced knowledge and civilization. These mysterious mound builders were variously theorized to be lost tribes of Israel who migrated to the Americas, wandering Europeans or Phoenicians who reached North America in antiquity, survivors from Atlantis or other legendary civilizations, an advanced race that was later conquered or absorbed by primitive native tribes. This wasn't just academic speculation. It served a direct political purpose. If Native Americans hadn't built the mounds, they had no special historical claim to the lands that contained them. They were recent arrivals, just like European colonists. Therefore, westward expansion could proceed with reduced moral complication. If indigenous peoples weren't connected to the ancient civilizations that once flourished here, their displacement was less troubling. The myth was widespread, believed by prominent Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about it extensively. It appeared in newspapers, textbooks, and scientific journals. It shaped policy and public opinion. The Smithsonian's Cyrus Thomas demolished this myth with his 1894 report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. He proved conclusively through careful excavation and analysis that Native American ancestors built the mounds. The engineering was entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. The cultural continuity was clear. This was real scholarship, opposing racist pseudo-history. Thomas deserves credit for applying scientific rigour to politically charged questions, but some researchers claim the Smithsonian went too far in the opposite direction. In the effort to combat the mound builder myth, they argue, the institution minimised the genuine complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American civilizations. The conspiracy theory goes like this. Acknowledging truly advanced indigenous civilizations would raise uncomfortable questions. It would force recognition of what was lost during European colonization. It would complicate the narrative of European civilization bringing progress and enlightenment to a primitive continent. It would create moral and legal complications regarding land rights and historical injustice, so evidence of that complexity and advancement when it appeared was acknowledged but not emphasized. It was studied but not celebrated. It was preserved but not prominently displayed. Consider Cahokia, the ancient city near modern St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was larger than London. Its population exceeded 10,000, possibly reaching 20,000. Its central plaza covered 40 acres. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork, rose 100 feet high and covered 14 acres at its base. It contained more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was an urban civilization. It had sophisticated agriculture supporting large populations, extensive trade networks reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, complex social hierarchies and specialised labour, advanced astronomical knowledge demonstrated by structures precisely aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia was not a village, it was a metropolis, and it existed at the same time as medieval European cities, yet how many Americans learned about Cahokia in school? For most people educated before the late 20th century, the answer is none. It simply wasn't taught. It wasn't part of the standard curriculum. It didn't appear in history textbooks alongside accounts of European medieval cities. Why not? The evidence was there. Archaeologists knew about Cahokia. The Smithsonian had extensive materials from the site. But Cahokia didn't fit the narrative. It complicated the story of indigenous peoples as primarily hunter-gatherer societies. It suggested pre-Columbian civilization in North America was far more advanced than commonly believed. The city collapsed mysteriously around 1300, before European contact. Climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, possibly epidemic disease. The reasons remain debated. But its very existence challenged comfortable assumptions. So it was studied by specialists but not integrated into popular understanding of American history. This is changing. Cahokia is now recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It appears in modern textbooks. Public awareness is growing, but for over a century, despite being the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, it was effectively absent from mainstream historical consciousness. The conspiracy theory asks, what else don't we know? What other achievements were documented, then quietly forgotten? What evidence of indigenous technological advancement, astronomical knowledge, or cultural complexity never made it into textbooks because it was inconvenient? Consider another example, the astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Chaco was a major centre of ancestral Puebloan culture from approximately 850 to 1150. Its great houses are precisely aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Structures mark solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills with remarkable accuracy. This demonstrates sophisticated astronomical observations sustained over generations. It required detailed record-keeping, mathematical understanding, and engineering precision. Yet for decades, mainstream archaeology attributed these alignments to coincidence, or was simply silent about them. The idea that primitive societies carefully tracked celestial movements made some scholars uncomfortable. It suggested knowledge and sophistication that didn't fit prevailing assumptions. Modern archaeology fully acknowledges Chacoan astronomical knowledge. But for how long was this evidence available but not emphasized? The pattern repeats. Evidence exists of ancient indigenous achievement. Evidence is preserved in museums and academic collections, but evidence is not prominently displayed, not featured in textbooks, not integrated into popular understanding. Is this conspiracy? Not in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle and perhaps more pervasive. Cultural bias expressed through curatorial choices made over decades. The Smithsonian didn't destroy evidence of indigenous achievement, but did it choose to emphasize certain narratives while downplaying others? Did it make decisions about what merited prominent display versus storage in archives? And were those decisions influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by prevailing cultural attitudes about indigenous peoples? Modern archaeology is correcting this. Indigenous scholars are reclaiming their history. Collaborative projects between researchers and tribal nations are producing more complete, more accurate accounts of the past. The Smithsonian itself has become more collaborative, more inclusive, more willing to acknowledge indigenous expertise about their own histories. But the question persists. How much time was lost? How many artifacts were categorized incorrectly, stored improperly, or simply ignored because they didn't fit expected narratives? And how would we know what we're missing if evidence was never prominently displayed, if it never entered public consciousness? If it languished in storage for a century, the effect is the same as if it never existed. This is the power of institutional gatekeeping, not to destroy truth, but to determine which truths receive attention. Chapter 6. Whistleblower Stories. The stories appear on forums, blogs, and alternative research websites with remarkable consistency. Different authors, different time periods, but similar themes. A former Smithsonian curator, speaking on condition of anonymity, claims they were instructed to reclassify certain artefacts to less provocative categories. Items initially catalogued as undetermined origin, or requires further study, were recategorized as natural formation or modern contamination without additional analysis. A researcher who worked in the institution's storage facilities in the 1980s describes being told certain areas were off limits without clear explanation. When they asked about specific catalogue numbers that should have been in those restricted areas, they were redirected to different materials entirely. An archaeologist who submitted findings to Smithsonian journals in the 1990s claims their work was rejected not for methodological flaws but for implications that would confuse the public. The rejection letter, which they claim to have kept but never publicly shared, supposedly stated that while the research was sound, publication would generate more questions than the current evidence base can answer. A museum technician who worked at the Smithsonian in the 2000s reports finding boxes in deep storage labelled with catalogue numbers that didn't appear in digital databases. When they brought this discrepancy to supervisors' attention, they were told the items were awaiting proper cataloguing and not to worry about it. The technician claims they later tried to locate those same boxes and couldn't find them. These accounts are impossible to verify. No names are provided, no documentation is offered. No corroborating witnesses come forward. They exist in that frustrating grey zone between plausible and provable. Could these things have happened? Absolutely. Institutional politics exist everywhere. Museums make curatorial decisions that aren't always transparent. Researchers do face pressure to conform to accepted narratives, but without verification, these stories remain rumour. They prove nothing beyond the fact that people are willing to claim such things occurred, yet they persist and multiply. The pattern of anonymous whistleblower accounts has become part of conspiracy culture around the Smithsonian. The most detailed account comes from a person claiming to be a former Smithsonian anthropologist who worked there in the 1970s. This account has circulated online in various forms for years. According to this story, the individual was assigned to catalogue skeletal remains from southwestern excavations conducted in the 1960s. The remains were from multiple sites, most fitting normal demographic patterns for the cultures and time periods involved. But among the hundreds of specimens, several stood out. The account describes skeletal remains showing unusual proportions, not wildly outside normal ranges, but statistically anomalous. Heights that would have been remarkable for the populations and time periods they supposedly represented. Upon reporting these unusual specimens to supervisors, the whistleblower claims they were initially told to document everything normally. Measurements were taken, photographs were made, preliminary analysis was conducted. But then, according to the account, the unusual specimens were separated from the main collection. They were moved to a different storage area. The individual was informed that further analysis had determined the measurements were erroneous due to bone displacement and mineralization effects. When they asked to see the revised analysis, they were told it was handled by senior staff and wasn't available for review. The unusual specimens were reclassified as within normal variation. The original measurements were noted as preliminary and superseded. No further study was conducted that the whistleblower was aware of. The specimens were filed away. The catalogue entries made no mention of the initial unusual findings. The account continues. When this individual asked colleagues about the situation, they were told, off the record, that the institution had guidelines about what kinds of claims could be made based on skeletal evidence. Extraordinary measurements required extraordinary context and documentation. Without clear provenance and supporting evidence, it was better to err on the side of conservative interpretation. One supervisor allegedly told them, "We don't have context for these anomalies. Without context, they create more confusion than clarity. Our job is to educate the public, not generate sensational headlines." The whistleblower claims they remained at the Smithsonian for several more years, but grew increasingly uncomfortable with what they perceived as unwillingness to pursue uncomfortable questions. They eventually left for a position elsewhere and later shared their story anonymously. Is this account real? There's no way to confirm it. The level of detail suggests someone with genuine institutional knowledge. The described procedures sound plausible for how large museums operate. But it could also be complete fabrication by someone familiar with museum operations, creating a story that sounds authentic without being verifiable. This is the essential problem with whistleblower accounts. They exist in the absence of hard evidence. They appeal to people already suspicious of institutions. They confirm existing beliefs rather than challenging them. And yet, complete dismissal seems unwarranted. Institutions do sometimes prioritize reputation over transparency. Scientists do face pressure to conform. Curatorial decisions are sometimes made for political or practical reasons rather than purely scientific ones. The truth probably lies somewhere between conspiracy and complete innocence. Not deliberate destruction of evidence, but a culture that favours certain kinds of findings over others. Not malicious cover-up, but selective attention driven by unconscious bias and institutional inertia. That's actually more concerning than cartoon villainy, because it's harder to address and easier to deny. Chapter 7. Why the Smithsonian is targeted. Why does the Smithsonian attract these conspiracy theories while other museums largely escape similar accusations? The answer lies in the institution's unique position within American cultural and scientific infrastructure. The Smithsonian isn't just another museum. It's the museum. It's a federal institution with authority and resources unmatched by any private collection. It sets standards for museum practice nationwide. It influences educational curricula. Its conclusions shape textbooks, documentaries, and public understanding of history and science. When the Smithsonian makes a determination about an artifact's age, origin, or significance, that determination carries weight across the entire field. Other institutions defer to Smithsonian expertise. Publishers rely on Smithsonian research. Teachers present Smithsonian conclusions as established fact. This creates enormous responsibility, and responsibility creates pressure. The institution holds more American archaeological and anthropological material than any other organisation. If something was discovered in the United States and deemed scientifically significant in the last century and a half, there's a substantial probability it ended up in Smithsonian collections. This creates a paradox. The organisation most capable of preserving and studying controversial evidence is also the organisation most invested in established narratives. It has the most to lose from paradigm shifts that would invalidate decades of previous work, publications, and institutional positions. Think about the incentive structure. You're a Smithsonian curator with decades of experience. You've published extensively on the peopling of the Americas, arguing for the Clovis first model, which suggested humans arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, via the Bering Land Bridge. Then evidence emerges suggesting much earlier human presence. Monteverde in Chile, dated to 14,500 years ago. Pre-Clovis sites in North America. Genetic evidence suggesting multiple migration waves. This evidence contradicts your life's work. Do you immediately embrace the new findings and acknowledge your previous conclusions were wrong? Subject the new evidence to rigorous scrutiny, looking for methodological flaws. Resist paradigm change until the evidence becomes absolutely overwhelming. Most scientists choose option 2, which is actually appropriate. Extraordinary claims should face rigorous examination, but there's a fine line between healthy skepticism and entrenched resistance. And when an entire institution has built its reputation on certain historical narratives, that line becomes even harder to navigate. The Smithsonian is also tied to government, which amplifies conspiracy thinking. It's formally a trust instrumentality of the United States, created by Congress and partially funded through federal appropriations. This connection to government makes it a target for people who generally distrust federal institutions. If you believe the government routinely lies to citizens about significant matters, why wouldn't that extend to the Smithsonian? If cover-ups occur in national security or politics, why not in archaeology? The theory becomes less about specific malicious acts and more about institutional inertia and risk avoidance. Consider a scenario. A donor brings an artifact to the Smithsonian. It's unusual. Initial analysis suggests it might challenge accepted timelines for technological development in ancient cultures, but the provenance is unclear. The context is ambiguous. You, as a curator, have several options. Display it prominently, acknowledging uncertainty but inviting public engagement with the mystery. Study it extensively, committing significant resources to what might ultimately prove to be a misidentified or contaminated specimen. Catalogue it conservatively, note the uncertainties, and store it for potential future study when better analytical methods might be available. Set it aside as insufficiently documented to merit serious attention. Which choice serves the institution's mission of education and research? Which serves your career advancement? Which protects the institution's reputation for scientific rigour? Which creates the least immediate disruption? In most cases, the conservative choice wins, not because of conspiracy, but because of bureaucracy, because of limited resources and competing priorities, because of reputational concerns and risk aversion. And over decades, those individual conservative choices accumulate. They create patterns. They generate gaps between what exists in collections and what receives attention. And gaps, once noticed by persistent researchers, fuel conspiracy theories. The Smithsonian also suffers from its own success. Its collections are so vast, 140 million items, that complete organisation and accessibility is nearly impossible. Even with modern database technology, materials slip through cracks. Catalogue numbers don't match physical locations. Items are stored in facilities that don't have comprehensive digital inventories. This ordinary chaos of managing massive collections becomes sinister when researchers can't find specific items they're looking for. The mundane explanation is, the collections are huge and imperfectly organised. The conspiratorial explanation is, items were deliberately hidden or removed. Both might be partially true. The collections are huge and imperfectly organised, and some items were probably deliberately set aside, not out of conspiracy, but out of curatorial judgment about what merited limited resources and attention. The institution has also made genuine mistakes throughout its history. It's displayed forgeries as authentic artifacts. It's made claims about human evolution that later proved incorrect. It's supported now debunked theories about ancient cultures. These mistakes are actually evidence that science works through self-correction. They show the institution is capable of admitting error and updating positions based on new evidence. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority is fallible, trust becomes conditional rather than automatic. The Smithsonian conspiracy theories endure because the institution occupies a unique position combining enormous authority over historical narratives, federal government connection, vast collections with inevitable organisational imperfections, history of genuine mistakes and course corrections, incentive structures that favour conservative interpretations. This combination makes it a natural target for conspiracy thinking, regardless of whether actual conspiratorial behaviour has occurred. Chapter 8. Official Responses and Rebuttals. The Smithsonian Institution has addressed these conspiracy theories multiple times over the decades, with increasing frustration as the internet age has amplified their spread. Their official position is remarkably consistent. The institution does not destroy evidence for ideological or political reasons. The institution does not hide artifacts that challenge established theories. The institution applies rigorous scientific standards to all specimens, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When conspiracy theorists point to 19th century, newspaper accounts of giant skeletons, Smithsonian representatives and mainstream archaeologists respond with several counter-arguments. First, early American archaeology lacked professional standards. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs with no formal training. Measurements were frequently inaccurate. Documentation was poor or non-existent. When a 19th century newspaper reports a skeleton measuring 9 feet, modern archaeologists ask, who measured it? What methods were used? Was the skeleton complete or reconstructed from fragments? Were the bones properly identified as human rather than animal remains? In most cases, these basic questions cannot be answered because the documentation doesn't exist. The newspaper reports offer sensational claims without methodological detail. Second, there are numerous documented cases of misidentification. Large animal bones were frequently mistaken for giant human remains. Mastodons, mammoths, and large extinct mammals left bones that could appear human to untrained observers. The giant skull, discovered in Missouri in 1894, initially reported as evidence of an ancient race of giants, was later identified as belonging to a cave bear. The finder was genuinely convinced it was human, but expert analysis proved otherwise. Without the actual bones available for modern analysis, we cannot know how many giant skeleton reports were similar misidentifications. Third, geological and biological processes can create illusions of greater size. Bones can be displaced by soil movement, making scattered remains appear to represent a larger individual than they actually do. Mineralization can cause bones to expand. Decomposition can separate remains in ways that suggest greater dimensions. Fourth, hoaxes were common. The Cardiff giant, the Piltdown man, numerous other fraudulent discoveries fooled respected scientists in their time. If trained observers could be deceived by deliberate fakes, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misinterpret genuine remains? The absence of these giant skeletons in current collections has mundane explanations. They never existed as described. They were animal bones misidentified as human. They were normal human remains measured incorrectly. They were hoaxes. They were destroyed in fires, floods, or other disasters that affected museum collections. They were lost during one of the Smithsonian's several relocations and reorganizations. They were deaccessioned when provenance could not be verified. Any of these explanations is more probable than deliberate destruction to hide evidence. When conspiracy theorists claim specific artifacts have disappeared, Smithsonian archivists point out the realities of managing historical collections. The institution has accessioned materials for over 175 years. Early catalogue systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes recorded under descriptions that don't match modern search. Terms, storage locations changed multiple times. Different departments used different numbering systems. Finding a specific artifact from a 19th century accession can be genuinely difficult, even for staff with full access to collections and databases. This doesn't mean the item was hidden. It means institutional memory is imperfect, and early record keeping was inadequate by modern standards. Additionally, museums regularly deaccession materials. This isn't destruction of evidence, it's responsible collection management. Items are deaccessioned when provenance cannot be verified. The item is a duplicate of better specimens already in the collection. The item is deteriorating beyond conservation capacity. The item was misidentified and doesn't actually represent what it was catalogued as. The item is more appropriate for a different institution's collection. These decisions are documented and reviewable. They're not secret, but they do mean that not everything ever accessioned remains permanently in the collection. When critics claim the institution downplays evidence of advanced ancient technology, archaeologists offer context. Ancient civilizations were sophisticated. This is acknowledged and celebrated. But sophistication doesn't mean they possess knowledge or technology beyond what we can demonstrate through evidence. The precision of Egyptian engineering is remarkable, but experimental archaeology has shown that proposed ancient methods could achieve similar results given sufficient time and labour. The Antikythera mechanism is extraordinary, but it's an outlier. We have no other examples of similar devices from that period, suggesting it was exceptional rather than representative of general technological capabilities. The Baghdad battery might have generated current, but that doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. It could be coincidental electrochemistry from a device designed for different purposes. The mainstream position isn't that ancient people were primitive, it's that we need solid evidence before attributing capabilities to them. Speculation should be clearly identified as such, rather than presented as fact. Regarding Indigenous history, the Smithsonian has acknowledged past failures to adequately recognise and display pre-Columbian achievements. Modern exhibits have corrected this. Collaborative programs with tribal nations have expanded. Indigenous voices are increasingly centred in interpretation of their own histories. These changes demonstrate institutional willingness to evolve and acknowledge past shortcomings. They show the Smithsonian responding to legitimate criticism. But conspiracy theorists interpret even these positive changes differently. They see them as admissions that evidence was previously suppressed. If the institution now acknowledges greater indigenous sophistication, doesn't that prove they were downplaying it before? The Smithsonian's response: understanding evolves. New research produces new insights. Changing interpretations reflects scientific progress, not previous conspiracy. When confronted with whistleblower accounts, the institution cannot respond to unverified, anonymous claims. If someone has evidence of wrongdoing, they should present it through proper channels. Anonymous forum posts prove nothing. The overall Smithsonian position boils down to science is a process. Our understanding of the past is constantly being refined. Mistakes have been made and corrected. But there is no systematic effort to hide evidence or suppress truth. Archaeologists argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims 10-foot-tall humans once lived in North America, we need more than newspaper clippings. We need bones, measurements, DNA analysis, and contextual evidence. If someone claims ancient Americans had advanced technology far beyond what we currently understand, we need artifacts that cannot be explained through known capabilities. Absence of such evidence, despite extensive archaeological work across the Americas, suggests the claims are unfounded. But for conspiracy theorists, official denials only deepen suspicion. Of course, the institution would deny wrongdoing. What else would they say? This is the impossible position institutions face when accused of conspiracy. Evidence of innocence can be dismissed as cover-up. Lack of evidence for conspiracy can be explained as successful concealment. The argument becomes unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable claims aren't science, they're faith. Chapter 9. Why the Theory Endures. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory persists not primarily because of evidence, but because of context, because of how it fits into broader patterns of institutional distrust, because of how it answers uncomfortable questions, because it offers simple explanations for complex realities. Several factors ensure the theory's continued vitality despite lack of proof. First, early American archaeology did lack standards. This is historical fact. Before professional archaeology developed as a discipline in the early 20th century, excavation techniques were crude. Documentation was inconsistent or non-existent. Amateur enthusiasts conducted digs with no scientific training. Farmers unearthed burial mounds looking for valuables. Collectors hired labourers to dig for artefacts without recording context. Newspapers reported sensational finds without verification. This chaotic early period created a documentary record full of questionable claims, exaggerations, and outright frauds. Some of this material is now recognisable as false, but some sits in an ambiguous zone where we can neither prove nor disprove the claims. That ambiguity breeds speculation. If we can't definitively say certain reports were wrong, maybe they were right. And if they were right, where did the evidence go? Second, museums historically did make mistakes. They displayed forgeries. They supported incorrect theories. They made claims that later proved embarrassing. The Smithsonian exhibited the Cardiff giant before it was proven to be a hoax. The institution supported now discredited theories about human evolution. It displayed archaeological interpretations that subsequent research contradicted. These are actually signs that science works through self-correction. They demonstrate that institutions can admit error and update positions. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority can be wrong, every claim becomes potentially questionable. Third, real cover-ups have occurred in other contexts, fueling generalised distrust. Governments have hidden information about military experiments, environmental contamination, and public health risks. Corporations have suppressed research about product safety. Scientific institutions have at times been slow to acknowledge findings that challenged powerful interests. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, tobacco industry research manipulation, pharmaceutical companies hiding adverse trial results. These proven conspiracies establish that institutions can and do conceal truth when motivated to do so. So when conspiracy theorists look at the Smithsonian, they reason, if cover-ups happen in medicine and industry and government, why not in archaeology? What makes museums immune to the same pressures? Fourth, genuine mysteries remain unsolved. Ancient engineering feats we don't fully understand, artifacts that don't fit neatly into established timelines, cultural achievements that seem advanced for their supposed technological context. Mainstream archaeology offers explanations, but they sometimes feel incomplete. They require imagining capabilities we can't quite reconstruct. They involve lost techniques we can only theorize about. In that gap between achievement and explanation, conspiracy theories flourish. If we don't know exactly how they did it, maybe they had help we're not acknowledging. Maybe evidence of that help has been suppressed. Fifth, the absence of proof becomes part of the narrative. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, conspiracy theorists ask, why can't they produce the giant skeletons mentioned in those newspaper accounts? Why aren't the artifacts from old expedition reports available for study? The official answer is reasonable. The items probably never existed as described, or they were destroyed through ordinary causes, or they're simply lost in vast, imperfectly organised collections. But conspiracy theorists here, they existed, and someone made them disappear. This is the insidious logic of conspiracy thinking. Any gap in the record becomes potential evidence. Any missing data suggests intentional concealment. Absence of proof is reframed as proof of absence. Sixth, the theory is emotionally satisfying. It provides simple answers to complex questions. It creates villains and heroes. It suggests that truth is being suppressed but can be recovered through persistent investigation. It's more comfortable to believe in conspiracy than to accept that. Much of the past is genuinely unknowable. Documentary evidence is often unreliable. Our understanding is incomplete and uncertain. Some mysteries may never be solved. Conspiracy offers certainty. It says, we would know the truth if they hadn't hidden it. The knowledge exists, just concealed. This is psychologically easier than accepting fundamental uncertainty. Seventh, the internet has amplified and preserved conspiracy claims, while making authoritative rebuttals seem like just another opinion. Before the internet, conspiracy theories spread through books and word of mouth. They faced gatekeepers, publishers, librarians, educators who could evaluate credibility. Now, a blog post claiming Smithsonian cover-ups has the same accessibility as an official institutional statement, actually often more accessibility because conspiracy content is engineered for engagement while official responses are written in careful academic language. Search algorithms can't evaluate truth. They evaluate popularity and relevance. If thousands of people share a conspiracy claim, it rises in search results regardless of accuracy. Young people researching topics for school and counter-conspiracy websites alongside authoritative sources. Without training in source evaluation, how do they distinguish between them? Eighth, the conspiracy theory serves political and ideological purposes for some believers. For those who reject mainstream science on religious grounds, evidence that scientific authorities are unreliable supports their worldview. If the Smithsonian hides giant skeletons mentioned in the Bible, this confirms that secular science cannot be trusted. For those who oppose government and federal institutions on principle, the Smithsonian as a federal entity makes an appealing target. Proving federal dishonesty in one area justifies distrust in all areas. For those who feel marginalized by academic culture, conspiracy theories offer a way to claim superior knowledge. I know the truth that experts hide. These motivations ensure the theory's persistence regardless of evidence. The tragedy is that some legitimate questions get lost in conspiracy noise. Questions about how curatorial decisions are made and whether they involve unconscious bias. How institutional culture affects which research questions receive attention and resources. How gaps in historical knowledge should be acknowledged and communicated. How to balance certainty and uncertainty in public education. These are important questions worthy of serious discussion, but they get overshadowed by claims of deliberate deception and hidden giants. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory endures because it offers what humans crave: simple explanations, clear villains, and the promise that truth is just hidden. not genuinely unknown. Reality is messier, truth is harder. Chapter 10. Truth, Trust, and Institutions. Strip away the allegations about giants and lost civilizations. Remove the claims of destroyed evidence and hidden artifacts. What remains is a deeper, more fundamental question that the conspiracy theories dance around without directly addressing. Who do we trust to tell history? And what happens when that trust proves conditional? The Smithsonian institution shapes how millions of Americans understand the past. Its exhibits become common knowledge, the background facts that educated people are expected to know. Its publications influence textbooks that shape what children learn. Its researchers appear in documentaries, offering expert testimony that carries the weight of institutional authority. This is enormous power. Power to define what is important and what is trivial. Power to determine which narratives enter public consciousness and which remain known only to specialists. Power to shape collective memory. But authority is not infallibility, and trust should not mean blind acceptance. Institutions are made of people. People have biases, blind spots, career incentives, and social pressures. People make decisions based not only on evidence but on feasibility, palatability, and institutional priorities. Organizations develop cultures. Some questions become acceptable to ask, others uncomfortable. Some conclusions are easy to support, others require defending against skeptical colleagues. Some research directions receive funding and encouragement, others face obstacles. This doesn't make institutions evil, it makes them human. And humanity involves limitation. The conspiracy theories about the Smithsonian often miss this nuance. They imagine a shadowy group deliberately hiding truth, making conscious decisions to deceive the public. The reality is probably more mundane and in some ways more troubling. Not conspiracy, but culture. A culture that values consensus over disruption. That prefers established narratives over unsettling questions. That makes conservative choices about what to emphasize and what to set aside. Over time, those individual choices accumulate. They create a version of history that is coherent, comfortable, and teachable. But is it complete? Is it accurate in all its particulars? Or does it sometimes smooth over complications, avoid uncertainties, and privilege certain stories over others? We know the Smithsonian has changed its positions before. Archaeological understanding has evolved. Theories once considered mainstream are now rejected. Evidence once dismissed has been re-evaluated and accepted. The Clovis first model, which held that humans first arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, was institutionally supported for decades. Evidence of earlier occupation was viewed skeptically. Sites suggesting pre-Clovis presence faced extraordinary scrutiny. Then accumulating evidence became overwhelming. Monteverde in Chile, genetic data showing multiple migration waves, pre-Clovis artifacts in North America. The paradigm shifted. Institutions including the Smithsonian adjusted their positions. This is how science should work. Self-correction through new evidence and better methods. But it also means what institutions tell us today is subject to revision tomorrow. What we're told is established fact might be updated or overturned in the future. If institutions can be wrong, the question becomes, how do we know when they are? How do we distinguish between legitimate scientific consensus and institutional inertia protecting incorrect conclusions? This is genuinely difficult. We cannot all become experts in every field. We must rely on authorities. But uncritical reliance creates vulnerability to institutional mistakes and biases. The healthy middle path involves respecting expertise while maintaining critical awareness, trusting institutional knowledge while understanding its limitations, accepting scientific consensus as the best current understanding while remaining open to revision, distinguishing between conspiracy theories and legitimate critiques of institutional practices. This requires nuance. It requires holding seemingly contradictory ideas simultaneously. Institutions deserve scrutiny and their claims should be questioned. And also, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and skepticism applies to conspiracy theories too. The Smithsonian's darkest secret might not be hidden artifacts or destroyed evidence. It might be something simpler and more universal. The impossibility of perfect transparency in an institution managing millions of items, nearly 2 centuries of history, and the weight of public expectation. How can any organisation be fully accountable when the task itself is overwhelming? How can curators document every decision when making thousands daily? How can researchers address every anomaly when resources are limited and priorities must be set? The gaps in the record aren't necessarily evidence of conspiracy. They might be evidence of limitation, of the inevitable imperfections of any human endeavour operating at massive scale across generations. But limitation can enable concealment. Disorganisation can achieve what conspiracy would require, and we cannot easily distinguish between innocent chaos and deliberate obscuration from outside the institution. This uncertainty is uncomfortable. We want clear answers. We want to know whether to trust or distrust. We want institutions to be either reliable authorities or proven frauds. Reality offers neither certainty. Institutions are fallible but often reliable, sometimes wrong but frequently right, deserving of trust but requiring oversight. The conspiracy theories offer escape from this ambiguity. They promise that truth is clear, just hidden. They suggest that uncertainty is manufactured rather than inherent. But the real world is uncertain. The past is fragmentary. Our knowledge is incomplete and probably always will be. The question isn't whether the Smithsonian is perfectly trustworthy. No institution is. The question is whether it operates with reasonable integrity, corrects mistakes when identified, and serves its stated mission of preserving and sharing knowledge despite inevitable human limitations. The evidence suggests it does, imperfectly but genuinely. The conspiracy theories suggest it doesn't, perfectly and deliberately. Which interpretation fits the available evidence better? Which is more consistent with how institutions actually function? The truth, as usual, resists simplicity. Epilogue: the locked vault question. Deep in the Smithsonian storage facilities, there are rooms most visitors never see, will never see, cannot see without explicit permission and documented research purpose. Rows of metal shelving holding thousands of cardboard boxes, climate-controlled spaces preserving fragile specimens from light, moisture and temperature fluctuations, cabinets filled with items waiting for study, cataloguing, or simply space in public galleries that may never come. The institution holds 140 million objects. This number is almost incomprehensible. If you spent 1 second looking at each item, it would take over 4.5 years of continuous observation without sleep. Only a tiny fraction is ever displayed. Most sit in storage, accessible to researchers by appointment, but invisible to the general public. Out of sight, out of mind. What's in those boxes? Mostly the expected. Pottery shards catalogued by culture and approximate date. Stone tools labelled by type and location. Skeletal remains stored according to established protocols. Textile fragments preserved in acid-free containers. The ordinary artefacts of ordinary lives, collectively telling stories about how people lived, worked, created and died. But also inevitably anomalies. Things that don't fit neat categories. Items with unclear provenance that make definitive conclusions difficult. Specimens that raise more questions than they answer. Questions that current methodologies cannot adequately address. Some of these anomalies get studied. Grad students write dissertations. Papers appear in specialised journals. Mysteries get solved or at least better understood. The anomaly becomes integrated into knowledge, explained and categorised. Some sit, waiting for the right scholar with the right question, waiting for new analytical technology that might reveal secrets current methods cannot detect, waiting for someone to notice them among millions of other items competing for attention. And some, perhaps, are simply forgotten, not destroyed, not hidden, not deliberately concealed, just overlooked, set aside and never retrieved, lost in the vast bureaucracy of an organisation managing more material than any human mind can fully grasp. The conspiracy, Theory imagines intention, a deliberate choice to conceal. Curators meeting in shadowy rooms, deciding what truth the public can handle. Artifacts quietly destroyed to protect established narratives. The reality might be more banal and somehow more troubling. Neglect. The passive erasure that comes from having too much to manage and too few resources to manage it. The slow forgetting that happens when things sit unopened in boxes for decades. Either way, the effect approaches similarity. If something didn't fit the story of human history, if it challenged our understanding in ways we weren't ready to confront, if it required explanation that current paradigms couldn't provide, would we know if it disappeared into those storage rooms? Would we know if it was catalogued under a description that doesn't capture its significance? Filed in a location that makes it unlikely to be found? Assigned to a box that hasn't been opened since it was sealed decades ago? The Smithsonian maintains it operates with integrity. Its researchers are scientists, not censors. Its mission is knowledge, not narrative control. Its purpose is preserving truth, not concealing it. And they're probably right, in the overwhelming majority of cases. For the vast majority of decisions made daily by people trying their best under difficult circumstances, but probably and mostly an overwhelming majority, are not the same as certainly and always in every single case. The institution remains largely silent on specific conspiracy claims. It doesn't engage extensively with allegations it considers baseless. It lets its scientific work speak for itself. It maintains that those seeking evidence of wrongdoing will find none because none exists. The debate continues regardless, not because of evidence which remains absent, but because of doubt, which once planted grows deeper roots than any fact. And doubt has many sources: the documented gaps in records, the missing artifacts, described in century-old reports, the patterns of what receives attention versus what doesn't, the natural human tendency to distrust concentrated authority, the genuine mysteries that remain unexplained, the history of mistakes and course corrections, the simple fact that perfect transparency is impossible in any institution of this scale. In the end, we're left with questions that may never find definitive answers. Do we trust institutions to tell us the truth about the past? Can we trust them, given that they're human enterprises subject to all the failings humanity entails? Do we believe that everything discovered has been preserved and honestly presented? Do we accept that our understanding of history might be incomplete, not from conspiracy, but from the simple limitations of human knowledge and institutional capacity? Or do we wonder what sits in those boxes no one opens? What lies forgotten in storage areas that haven't been fully inventoried? What truths might be waiting in plain sight, catalogued too vaguely to be found? The Smithsonian's doors remain open. Its collections are vast. Its researchers welcome serious inquiry from qualified scholars. It has processes for access, review, and study. But the vaults are deep. The records are incomplete. The collections are massive beyond full comprehension. And the past, once gone, speaks only through what we choose to preserve and how we choose to interpret it. These choices, made over decades by thousands of individuals operating within institutional cultures and constraints, have shaped what we know and what we don't. Whether those choices were always made with perfect integrity, whether they were free from bias and political pressure, whether they prioritized truth over comfort in every instance, we cannot know with certainty from outside the institution. We can examine the evidence, evaluate the arguments, and reach conclusions about what seems most probable. But absolute certainty escapes us, as it does in most things worth thinking about deeply. Sleep well tonight, and remember, history is written by those who control the archives, and sometimes the most important question isn't what we know, it's what we'll never know we lost. The boxes sit in climate-controlled darkness, their contents waiting, their stories untold. Perhaps someday, someone will open them. Perhaps they already have, and found nothing of significance. Or perhaps they found something that changed everything, and we simply haven't heard about it yet. The vaults keep their secrets, and we are left to wonder. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's mysteries, please subscribe. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Dogface680, and we cannot thank you enough for this idea. This is one of the most compelling conspiracy theories rooted in actual Cold War history. And what makes it so haunting is how much of it is documented fact. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. A 4-star general, a war hero, the man who helped liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, dead in a hospital bed just months after victory, following a minor car accident that shouldn't have killed anyone. No autopsy, no investigation. Medical records vanished, witnesses disappeared, and decades later, a former intelligence operative steps forward with a confession that changes everything. This is the story of General George Smith Patton Jr., the man who won the war but lost the peace, the general who believed he had fought in past lives alongside Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed in destiny and glory and refused to be silent when silence was demanded. This is the story of his mysterious death, and the conspiracy theory that suggests the greatest threat to George Patton wasn't the Nazi Wehrmacht, it was his own government. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, Germany. The war is over. Europe lies in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble. Railways destroyed. Bridges collapsed. Millions dead. Millions more displaced. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 and ended in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot. Victory belongs to the Allies. And General George Smith Patton Jr., the most aggressive, most decorated, most controversial American commander of World War II, sits in occupied Germany with nothing left to conquer. He is 60 years old. His hair is silver. His face is weathered from years of command in the Mediterranean sun, the French countryside, the German winter. He wears his pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, relics of an earlier era when generals still led cavalry charges. He looks like something from another century, and in many ways he is. Patton believes he fought at the walls of Troy. He believes he rode with the Romans into Carthage. He believes he charged with Napoleon at Austerlitz. Past life memories, he calls them. Visions of ancient battles that feel more real than dreams. His officers think he's eccentric. His soldiers think he's touched by God. His enemies learned not to think about him at all until it was too late. But now, in December 1945, Patton is no longer commanding armies. He is no longer shaping strategy. He is no longer needed. The Third Army, which he led across France and into the heart of Germany, has been reassigned. His new command is a paper organisation with no soldiers, no tanks, no mission beyond compiling reports that no one will read. He is waiting to go home, and he is angry. That morning, December 9th, Patton wakes before dawn in his quarters at Bad Nauheim, a spa town north of Frankfurt that serves as headquarters for what remains of his command. He eats breakfast alone, as is his custom. Eggs, toast, coffee. He reviews intelligence reports from the Soviet occupation zone. He reads dispatches from Washington. He writes in his diary, the leather-bound journal he has kept since West Point, filling page after page with his cramped handwriting. Today's entry is bitter. They have sidelined me. Eisenhower fears what I might say. The politicians fear what I might do. The Soviets fear I might be right. So here I sit, a relic, while Europe burns. He signs his name with a flourish, as always. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, Third Army. At 9:30 in the morning, he receives word that a pheasant hunting expedition has been arranged for that afternoon. It's one of his few remaining pleasures, a brief escape from the tedium of meaningless command. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, will accompany him. They'll take one of the staff cars, drive south toward Mannheim, spend a few hours in the countryside. It should be routine. At 11 o'clock, Patton descends the stairs of his headquarters building. His boots echo on the marble floors. Officers snap to attention as he passes. He returns their salutes mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already planning the afternoon hunt, already thinking about the estate where the pheasants run wild. Outside, a Cadillac Model 75 sedan waits. Black paint, chrome trim, the kind of vehicle befitting a general officer. The driver stands beside it, a young private first class who has been assigned to Patton's detail for less than 2 weeks. This is the first irregularity. Patton's regular driver, a sergeant named John Mims, who had driven him for 3 years through combat and occupation, was transferred on December 1st. No explanation was given. Mims, interviewed decades later by researchers, said the transfer was sudden and unusual. He was given orders to report to another unit immediately. He never drove for Patton again. The replacement driver's name is in the accident report, but researchers have never been able to locate his service records. The man seems to have vanished from military documentation after December 9th. Patton climbs into the back seat. General Gay joins him. The driver starts the engine. They pull out of the headquarters compound and onto the road leading south. It's a cold morning. Frost covers the fields. The sky is grey, low clouds threatening snow. The roads are in poor condition, still cratered from the fighting, still littered with debris from the bombardment that reduced Mannheim to ruins earlier in the war. Traffic is light, a few military trucks, some civilian vehicles, German citizens walking along the roadside, bundled against the cold, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. Patton watches the landscape pass. He has driven these roads dozens of times. He knows every turn, every checkpoint, every landmark. At approximately 11:45, near a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim, the car approaches an intersection. A United States Army truck, a 2.5-ton vehicle painted olive drab, approaches from a side road. What happens next takes 3 seconds. The truck makes a sudden left turn, cutting directly across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The driver of the Cadillac swerves right, tyres skidding on the frost-slicked pavement. The vehicles collide, the sound of metal against metal, the crunch of breaking glass, the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator, and then silence. The driver of the Cadillac climbs out, shaken but uninjured. General Gay opens his door, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. A few bruises, perhaps. Nothing serious. He turns to check on Patton and sees him slumped in the back seat, conscious but unable to move. "My neck," Patton says quietly. "I think my neck is broken." Within minutes, military police arrive. Within an hour, Patton is on his way to Heidelberg. Within days, the official story begins to fracture under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And within 12 days, George Smith Patton Jr. is dead. Chapter 1. The General Who Became a Problem. To understand why conspiracy theories surround Patton's death, you have to understand who Patton was in the final months of his life, and more importantly, what he represented to the emerging Cold War order. George Smith Patton Jr. was never meant for peacetime. He was born into a military family in California in 1885. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father was a politician. Young George grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and desperate last stands, of honour and glory and the warrior's code. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point. He competed in the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He served under General John Pershing in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert. He commanded tanks in World War I, was wounded in combat, came home with a chest full of medals and a reputation as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied. He read military history obsessively. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. He believed war was an art form, that great commanders were born, not made, that destiny selected certain men for greatness. He believed he was one of those men. When World War II came, Patton was ready. He commanded American forces in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. His Third Army swept across Europe faster than anyone thought possible. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes reckless. He believed in speed and shock and overwhelming force. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire. His methods worked. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They repositioned entire divisions based on intelligence about Patton's location. They assumed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. Often, they were right. But Patton was more than just a brilliant tactician. He was also politically tone-deaf, personally abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of diplomacy. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards. He gave speeches praising the fighting spirit of the German army. He made jokes about the Holocaust that appalled other officers. He criticised Allied strategy in press conferences. He feuded with British commanders. He defied orders when he thought they were stupid. Eisenhower protected him during the war because Patton won battles. But when the war ended, Patton became expendable. More than that, he became dangerous. Because Patton refused to accept the post-war order. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Allied leaders meet in Potsdam to negotiate the peace. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union takes the east, America and Britain take the west. Borders are redrawn, governments are installed, millions of people are displaced, moved, relocated to fit the new map. Patton watches this happen and sees betrayal. The Allies, he argues, fought to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now they're handing half of Europe to Stalin, a dictator as brutal as Hitler, a regime as totalitarian as the Nazis. He makes this argument publicly. In June 1945, Patton gives a speech in Los Angeles comparing the Soviet Communist Party to the Nazi Party. He calls both totalitarian threats to freedom. He suggests the Allies defeated the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been turned against the Soviet Union instead of being destroyed. The backlash is immediate. Politicians demand his resignation. Newspapers condemn him. The War Department issues official reprimands. President Truman, already dealing with the complexities of Soviet relations, is furious. Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters. The meeting does not go well. Eisenhower and Patton were friends once. They rose through the ranks together, served together between the wars, understood each other. But the war changed them both. Eisenhower became a political general, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the peace required compromise and patience. Patton remained a warrior who believed wars should be fought without hesitation and won without apology. In Eisenhower's office, Patton is told his public statements are unacceptable. He is ordered to stop criticising Soviet policy. He is warned that further incidents will result in his removal from command. Patton argues back. He presents intelligence reports about Soviet violations of ceasefire agreements. He describes forced population transfers, summary executions, political purges. He insists someone needs to tell the American people what's happening in occupied Europe. Eisenhower tells him that someone is not going to be Patton. The conversation ends badly. Within weeks, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organisation with no operational role. His job now is to compile lessons learned from the European campaign, to write reports analysing tactics and strategy for future military planners. It's a desk job. To a man like Patton, it's worse than death. Internal War Department memos from this period reveal the thinking behind the reassignment. One memo describes Patton as politically dangerous and increasingly uncontrollable. Another warns that Patton's celebrity status among soldiers and veterans makes him a potential political threat to current foreign policy initiatives. A third memo, written by a senior intelligence officer, suggests that Patton's return to the United States should be delayed indefinitely to prevent him from influencing public opinion regarding Soviet intentions. These memos were classified for decades. When they were finally released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, they revealed something important. By October 1945, senior American officials viewed Patton not as an asset but as a liability, and they were actively working to neutralise him. Chapter 2. The Diaries and the Warnings. General Patton kept meticulous diaries throughout his military career. These weren't casual journals. They were detailed historical records, written in his own hand, documenting everything from tactical decisions to personal reflections. He wrote almost every day, sometimes for hours, filling leather-bound volumes with his cramped, precise handwriting. He believed history would vindicate him. He wanted his perspective preserved for future generations. After his death, the diaries were collected by his family. Some entries were published in biographies, others remained private for decades. Some have never been fully released, held back by the Patton family estate for reasons never publicly explained. But the entries that have been made public from October and November 1945 paint a disturbing picture of a man who believed he was being watched, controlled, and silenced. October 2nd, 1945. Patton attends a meeting with Soviet officers to coordinate occupation zones. The meeting is tense. The Soviets refuse to cooperate on prisoner exchanges. They deny Allied access to certain territories. They claim violations of ceasefire agreements that Patton knows are fabricated. He writes, "The Russians are impossible. They lie about everything. They're worse than the Nazis and no one wants to admit it. Eisenhower orders me to maintain diplomatic relations. I'd rather maintain my rifle aimed at their headquarters." October 15th, 1945. Patton inspects Soviet troop positions along the occupation zone boundary. He notes their equipment, their readiness, their disposition. What he sees alarms him. He writes, "Soviet forces are not demobilizing. They're repositioning. They have combat units forward deployed, supply lines established, logistics prepared for offensive operations. If we have to fight them, and I believe we will, we should do it now while our armies are still here, still equipped, still ready. In 2 years, we'll have nothing in Europe, and they'll have everything." October 23rd, 1945. Patton meets with German civilians, former Wehrmacht officers, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. They tell him stories of mass arrests, forced labour, summary executions, entire villages emptied. He writes, "We promised these people freedom. We told them we were liberating them from tyranny. Now we're handing them to Stalin, who is every bit as brutal as Hitler. The only difference is Stalin is our ally, so we pretend not to see what he's doing. History will judge us harshly for this betrayal." October 31st, 1945. Patton submits a request for extended leave to return to the United States. He wants to visit family, rest, recover from years of combat command. He also wants to speak freely, away from military censorship about what he's witnessed in Europe. The request is denied by the War Department. No explanation is provided. He writes, "They want me here where they can watch me, where they can control what I say, where I can't reach the American people. I understand their game now." November 7th, 1945. Patton has lunch with a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune. The interview is supposed to be off the record, a background briefing about post-war Europe. Patton speaks candidly about Soviet intentions, about Allied failures, about the need for American military readiness. 2 days later, the journalist contacts Patton. The interview has been killed by editors. Someone from the War Department called the newspaper and asked that the story not run. The journalist is apologetic but clear. The article will not be published. Patton writes, "Even the press is controlled now. The truth is too dangerous for the American people to hear. They want everyone to believe we won the war, and everything is fine now. But nothing is fine. Everything we fought for is being given away, and anyone who points this out is silenced." November the 19th, 1945. Patton receives notice that his security detail is being changed. His regular driver, his aides, his bodyguards, men who have served with him for years are being reassigned. New personnel are being assigned to replace them. The official reason is routine rotation of personnel. Patton doesn't believe it. He writes, "They're putting watchers around me, new people who report to someone else. I recognise the pattern. I've used it myself in our intelligence operations. When you want to monitor someone, you put your own people next to them. I'm being treated like a security threat in my own command." November 25th, 1945. Patton's wife, Beatrice, writes him from the United States. She's worried about him. His letters have become dark, paranoid. He writes about being watched, about feeling trapped. She asks if he's well. He writes back, but his response never makes it into his diary. Later, Beatrice told biographers that Patton's letter frightened her. He wrote that he was planning to return home soon, and caused them a lot of trouble. He wrote that he intended to speak publicly about Soviet aggression and Allied failures. He wrote that he knew this would end his military career, but he didn't care anymore. He wrote, "Some fights are worth the cost." December 1st, 1945. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant John Mims, is abruptly transferred to another unit. Mims has driven Patton for 3 years through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He knows Patton's habits, his routes, his preferences. He's loyal, competent, trusted. The transfer happens overnight. Mims is given orders to report immediately to a quartermaster unit in Belgium. He's not allowed to say goodbye to Patton. A new driver is assigned, a young private first class who's been in the European theatre for less than 3 months. Patton writes, "Even my driver is replaced now. They're not even being subtle about it anymore." This is Patton's last diary entry. 8 days later, he's in the car accident. Chapter 3. The collision that changed everything. December the 9th, 1945. Late morning. General Patton's Cadillac sedan leaves his headquarters in Bad Nauheim at approximately 1100 hours. The sky is overcast, threatening snow. Temperature is just above freezing. The roads are slick with frost but passable. Patton sits in the back seat. He's dressed in his uniform, wearing his leather jacket against the cold. His pearl-handled revolvers are on his hips. He carries a walking stick, an affectation from his days of cavalry service. Major General Hobart Gay sits beside him. Gay has served as Patton's chief of staff throughout the war. He's one of Patton's few remaining friends in the High Command, one of the few officers who still speaks to him regularly after his controversial statements. The new driver, whose name appears in the accident report as Private First Class Horace Woodring, sits behind the wheel. He's nervous. He's only driven for Patton a handful of times. He's not familiar with the general's preferences, his habits, his routes. The drive should take less than an hour. They follow the main road south from Bad Nauheim, through small German towns still recovering from the war. Mannheim was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. The RAF and American 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its industrial districts. Much of the city centre was destroyed. Rebuilding has barely begun. The roads through Mannheim are in poor condition. Craters from bombs, debris from collapsed buildings. Some streets are still blocked entirely, forcing detours through unfamiliar routes. At 11:43, according to the accident report, Patton's Cadillac approaches a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim. The area is semi-rural, factories mixed with farmland. Traffic is light. A United States Army truck, identified in the report as a GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicle, approaches from a side road on the left. According to the truck driver's statement, taken by military police at the scene, he did not see the Cadillac approaching. He claimed the sun was in his eyes, though the day was overcast. He claimed he was unfamiliar with the intersection, though the road was clearly marked. He claimed he made the turn at normal speed, though witnesses said the truck accelerated suddenly. The Cadillac's driver swerves right to avoid impact. Too late. The vehicles collide at the intersection. Now here's where the official story begins to fall apart. The collision is low speed. The Cadillac is travelling approximately 35 miles per hour. The truck is travelling approximately 15 miles per hour. The impact is glancing, not head-on. The Cadillac's front passenger side strikes the truck's rear cargo area. The damage is minor. The Cadillac's front bumper is bent. The headlight is broken. The hood is dented. The truck's rear panel is scraped but intact. Both vehicles remain operational. The Cadillac's driver, Private First Class Woodring, is uninjured. He has a small bruise on his hand from the steering wheel. Nothing else. Major General Gay is uninjured. He experiences momentary shock from the impact, but suffers no physical trauma. The truck driver is uninjured. He climbs out of his cab without assistance. General Patton, sitting in the back seat of the Cadillac, suffers catastrophic injuries. According to the initial medical assessment, Patton was thrown forward in the collision. His head struck a metal partition or support structure in the car's interior. The impact caused acute cervical spine trauma, specifically a comminuted fracture of the third cervical vertebra and a vertical fracture of the fourth cervical vertebra. The injury results in immediate complete paralysis from the neck down. Multiple forensic analysts who examined the case decades later noted severe inconsistencies with this explanation. First, the injury pattern. A forward impact of the type described should cause predictable trauma. Facial injuries, chest contusions, possibly head trauma. The passenger would hit the seat in front of them, the back of the driver's seat, which is padded. Instead, Patton sustained a precise cervical fracture with no facial injuries, no chest trauma, no head contusions. Second, the biomechanics. For Patton to strike the partition with enough force to fracture his cervical spine, he would need to be travelling at significant speed relative to the car's interior. But the collision was low speed, and Patton was seated wearing his heavy leather jacket, which would have provided some padding. Third, the other passengers, both the driver and General Gay, sitting in front of Patton, experienced minimal impact forces. Gay later described the collision as a solid bump, nothing more. Yet Patton, behind them, experienced forces sufficient to break his neck. One forensic pathologist who reviewed the case in the 1990s suggested the injury pattern was more consistent with a direct blow to the back or side of the neck, the kind of trauma that might result from being struck by a hard object, rather than from impact with a car's interior. Another analyst noted that the specific fracture pattern, comminuted fracture of cervical 3, vertical fracture of cervical 4, is relatively rare in motor vehicle accidents, but more common in cases of direct trauma to the posterior neck. Without an autopsy, without X-rays beyond the initial hospital films, without detailed forensic analysis, these observations remain speculative. But they raise questions. Then there's the matter of the truck driver. According to the accident report, the driver was interviewed by military police at the scene. He provided a statement describing the collision. He was cited for failure to yield. He was released. His name appears in the report as Private Robert Thompson. No unit is listed. No serial number is recorded. No permanent address is given. Researchers have spent decades trying to locate Private Robert Thompson. Military personnel databases have no record of anyone by that name serving in the European theatre in December 1945. The truck's serial number, listed in the accident report, corresponds to a vehicle assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. But when historians tried to trace the vehicle's movement logs, maintenance records and assignment history, they found nothing. The truck existed on paper, but vanished from all documentation after December 9th. The military police who responded to the scene should have filed detailed reports, taken photographs, secured evidence. Standard accident investigation procedure, especially for a collision involving a 4-star general. No photographs were ever released. The military police reports were classified, then reported lost. No physical evidence from the scene was preserved. Within hours, the Cadillac was repaired and returned to the motor pool. The truck disappeared entirely. And Private Robert Thompson was never seen again. Chapter 4. 12 days in Heidelberg. The Heidelberg Army Hospital in December 1945 was one of the finest medical facilities in Europe. It had treated thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. It had experienced trauma surgeons, skilled nurses, modern equipment for 1940s medicine. The hospital specialised in combat injuries, including complex trauma cases that required intensive care. Spinal injuries like Patton's were rare but not unprecedented. The medical staff understood the protocols: immobilisation, prevention of secondary injury, monitoring for complications, physical therapy when possible. Patton arrived at the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on December 9th, less than 90 minutes after the accident. He was conscious, alert, able to speak. He described the accident to doctors. He reported complete loss of sensation and movement below his neck. He remained calm, even joking with the medical staff. "I've been closer to death than this before," he told one nurse. "I'll be fine." Initial X-rays confirmed the cervical fractures. Neurological examination confirmed complete paralysis below the level of injury, but the attending physicians were cautiously optimistic. The fractures, while severe, showed no signs of spinal cord transection. There was hope that with proper immobilization and time, some nerve function might return. Complete recovery was unlikely, but partial recovery was possible. Patton was placed in skull traction, a device that immobilized his head and neck to prevent further injury. He was given oxygen support. His vital signs were monitored continuously. Nurses attended him around the clock. On December 10th, one day after the accident, Patton's condition appeared stable. His vital signs were strong. He was communicating with staff. He showed no signs of infection or complications. On December 11th, Patton's wife Beatrice arrived from the United States. The Army had arranged emergency transport, flying her across the Atlantic on a military aircraft. She was escorted by senior officers who had worked to expedite her travel. When she entered Patton's room, he smiled. "I'm in a hell of a fix this time," he told her. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. He couldn't feel it, but the gesture mattered. For the next few days, Patton's condition remained stable. Doctors noted slight improvement in some reflexes. There was cautious talk of eventual transfer to a specialized facility in the United States. Physical therapy was discussed. Patton himself remained optimistic. He made plans. He talked about recovery. He joked about getting back to work. On December 13th, 4 days after the accident, Patton's condition began to change. He developed a slight fever. His breathing became more laboured. Doctors suspected early pneumonia, a common complication in paralysed patients who cannot cough effectively to clear their lungs. Antibiotics were administered. Oxygen support was increased. On December 14th, the fever worsened. Patton's oxygen saturation dropped. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The medical staff worked to keep his airways clear, but the paralysis made it nearly impossible for him to assist in his own treatment. On December 15th, 6 days after the accident, Patton's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He developed severe pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. His heart rate became irregular. His blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The doctors diagnosed acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his immobilised legs to his lungs. Emergency treatment was initiated, but Patton's condition continued to deteriorate. Over the next 6 days, he slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever persisted. The pulmonary edema worsened. His heart struggled to maintain adequate circulation. On December the 21st, 12 days after the accident, at 1750 hours, General George Smith Patton Jr. died. The official cause of death: pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure secondary to his injuries. The death certificate was signed by the attending physicians. The hospital issued a statement expressing condolences. The Army notified next of kin. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and then the irregularities began. First, no autopsy was performed. This is unusual for several reasons. Patton was a 4-star general, one of the most prominent military figures in American history. His death under medical care, with unexpected complications arising rapidly, would normally warrant a thorough post-mortem examination. The official explanation was that the family declined an autopsy. But Beatrice Patton later disputed this claim. In interviews with biographers, she stated she was never asked about an autopsy. She said the Army simply informed her that her husband's body would be prepared for burial and that no autopsy was necessary or planned. She said she didn't question the decision at the time. She was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed. She trusted the military doctors who told her Patton died of natural complications from his injuries. Only later did she wonder why they were so insistent that no autopsy be performed. Second, Patton's complete medical records from Heidelberg Hospital were never released to the family. Beatrice requested the files multiple times over the following years. She wanted to understand what happened to her husband, why he declined so rapidly, whether everything possible had been done to save him. Her requests were denied. The Army told her the medical records were classified for reasons of operational security. She was told the files contained sensitive information about medical procedures and treatment protocols that could not be disclosed. She never received the records. When historians and researchers sought the files decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests, they were told the records were missing. Some reports claim the files were destroyed in the 1960s per routine document retention policies. Other reports claim the files were lost when Heidelberg Hospital closed. Still other reports claim the files are held in classified archives but remain restricted. No one has seen Patton's complete medical records since December 1945. Third, several members of the medical staff who treated Patton were transferred shortly after his death. One surgeon was reassigned to a hospital in Japan. A nurse was transferred to a facility in England. The hospital administrator retired from military service within weeks of Patton's death. When researchers tried to interview these individuals in later years, most declined to participate. Some claimed they couldn't remember details of Patton's case. Others said they were bound by military confidentiality, even decades later. One physician agreed to an interview but died before it could be conducted. One nurse who worked in Heidelberg Hospital during December 1945 gave a brief interview to a researcher in 1976. She described unusual activity in the days before Patton died. She mentioned restricted access to Patton's room. She said only certain staff members were allowed to enter. She described visitors who came late at night, men in military uniforms who weren't logged in the visitor registry. She mentioned medical procedures that weren't part of standard treatment protocols. She said Patton received injections she didn't recognise, medications that weren't listed on his chart. When the researcher pressed for details, the nurse became vague and uncomfortable. She ended the interview abruptly and refused further contact. She died 2 years later. No additional interviews were ever conducted. Fourth, the timeline of Patton's decline doesn't match typical post-injury progression. Spinal injury patients certainly face complications. Pneumonia is common because paralysed patients cannot clear their lungs effectively. Blood clots are common because immobilised patients cannot move their limbs. Heart failure can occur due to the stress of injury and prolonged bed rest. But the speed and severity of Patton's decline struck some medical experts as unusual. One pulmonologist who reviewed the case in the 1980s noted that Patton went from stable and communicative to critical and dying in less than a week. While complications can arise quickly, the progression described in the available documentation seemed unusually rapid for a patient receiving intensive care in a modern facility. Another physician, a toxicologist, reviewed the symptoms described in newspaper reports from December 1945. Sudden pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia, rapid deterioration. He noted these symptoms could result from injury complications, but they could also result from certain poisonous substances. Specifically, he mentioned digitalis toxicity, which causes cardiac complications and pulmonary edema, and would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. Without an autopsy, without tissue samples, without toxicology analysis, there's no way to confirm or deny such theories. But the possibility exists, and that possibility, combined with all the other irregularities, fuels the conspiracy theory that Patton didn't die from his injuries. He was killed. Chapter 5. The OSS operative's confession. For more than 30 years, the official narrative of Patton's death remained unchallenged. Tragic accident, medical complications, natural death given his injuries. Historians wrote biographies portraying Patton as a brilliant but troubled commander whose life ended in unfortunate circumstances. Filmmakers made movies celebrating his military genius while depicting his death as a sad footnote to a legendary career. His death was accepted as tragic but unremarkable. And then, in 1979, everything changed. An 84-year-old man named Douglas DeWitt Bazata walked into the office of a military historian working on a book about the Office of Strategic Services. Bazata said he had information about General Patton's death, information that had been classified for more than 3 decades, information that, if true, would rewrite history. Douglas Bazata was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a fringe figure seeking attention. He was a legitimate war hero, with verifiable credentials and a documented history of service in America's wartime intelligence apparatus. Born in 1911, Bazata grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marine Corps in the early 1930s. He served in various capacities until the outbreak of World War II, when he was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. The OSS conducted some of the most sensitive operations of the war: espionage, sabotage, assassination, support for resistance movements, operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly and whose details remain classified even today. Bazata operated behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. He conducted sabotage operations against Nazi infrastructure. He organised partisan resistance networks. He gathered intelligence that helped Allied forces plan operations. His service record is documented in declassified OSS files. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and various foreign awards from governments he aided during the war. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fabrication, and he said he had killed George Patton, not personally, not directly, but as part of an operation ordered by senior American intelligence officials. According to Bazata, in late November 1945, he was approached by a high-ranking OSS officer. Bazata declined to name this officer publicly, saying only that he held a senior position in intelligence operations and had authority to order field operations without political oversight. The officer told Bazata that General Patton had become a problem. Patton's public criticisms of Soviet policy were undermining Allied unity at a crucial moment. The Cold War was beginning. The Yalta Conference had established a delicate balance between the United States and Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were working to establish networks in Eastern Europe, networks that required Soviet cooperation, or at least Soviet tolerance. Patton's rhetoric threatened all of it. His threats to return to the United States and speak publicly about Soviet aggression could turn American public opinion against cooperation with Stalin. His celebrity status among soldiers and veterans gave him a platform that could shape national policy. The officer told Bazata that political leadership had decided Patton needed to be silenced, permanently. Bazata claimed he refused at first. He argued that Patton was right about the Soviets, that someone needed to speak the truth about Soviet intentions. The officer told him this wasn't about truth. It was about stability. It was about maintaining diplomatic relationships long enough to establish American interests in post-war Europe. It was about preventing a premature confrontation with the Soviet Union that America wasn't ready to fight. The officer told him it was a matter of national security, and national security justified any action. Bazata claimed he was not directly involved in arranging the car accident. He said that aspect of the operation was handled by others, specialists in staged accidents and traffic collisions, but he confirmed the accident was not accidental. The truck driver, he said, was an operative, possibly OSS, possibly another agency. The collision was planned and executed as a way to remove Patton without raising suspicions of foul play. But the accident wasn't supposed to kill Patton. It was supposed to injure him seriously enough to prevent him from returning to the United States and speaking publicly. A career-ending injury that would sideline him while appearing accidental. The neck fracture was a bonus, ensuring Patton would never command again. But then Patton started to recover. Within days of the accident, doctors were talking about possible rehabilitation, about eventual transfer to the United States, about Patton potentially regaining some function. That wasn't acceptable. According to Bazata, the decision was made to finish the operation in the hospital. He claimed he was part of a team that had access to Heidelberg Hospital. They posed as medical staff or military visitors. They gained access to Patton's room, and they administered a substance that would trigger the complications that killed him. Bazata wouldn't specify what substance was used. He suggested something that would cause cardiac and pulmonary complications consistent with his injuries, something that would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening, something that would appear as natural progression of his condition. He said Patton died believing he was succumbing to his injuries, never knowing he was being murdered. Bazata claimed the operation was compartmentalized. Only a handful of people knew the full scope. The operatives involved were told only what they needed to know. Records were destroyed or classified. Witnesses were silenced through transfers, retirement, or more permanent means. He said Soviet intelligence was aware of the operation. They tacitly approved because Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was creating problems for Stalin as well. But the Soviets were not directly involved. This was an American operation for American reasons. He said the decision came from senior levels of American intelligence, possibly with approval from political leadership, though he had no direct evidence of White House involvement. He said he had stayed silent for more than 30 years out of loyalty to his country and fear of retaliation against himself and his family. But now, in his 80s, with most of the principals dead, he wanted the truth known. He wanted history to record what actually happened. Bezzeta's confession was explosive. The researcher who first interviewed him was sceptical, but as Bezzeta provided details, as he named other operations he had participated in, as he described OSS procedures and protocols that matched declassified documents, the researcher began to believe Bezzeta was telling the truth, at least telling what he believed to be the truth. The researcher published a book in 1981 that included Bezzeta's claims. The book created immediate controversy. Historians dismissed Bezzeta as a fabricator. The CIA, successor to the OSS, denied any knowledge of operations targeting Patton. The army reaffirmed that Patton died of natural complications from his accident. But Bezzeta didn't recant. In 1984, he attended an OSS Veterans Reunion dinner in Washington, D.C. During the event, he stood and publicly repeated his claims about Patton's death. He told a room full of former intelligence operatives that he had been part of the operation. The room fell silent. No one challenged him. No one confirmed him. But no one laughed either. The silence was telling. Several attendees later told journalists they believed Bezzeta might be telling the truth. Others said the story was plausible, given what they knew about OSS operations during the period. Still others said Bezzeta was either lying or confused, mixing real operations with imagined ones. Douglas Bezzeta died in 1999 at age 88, maintaining his story until the end. To this day, no evidence has emerged to definitively prove or disprove his claims. But the fact that a legitimate OSS operative with a documented service record made such specific allegations has kept the conspiracy theory alive. Chapter 6. The Missing Evidence in the Cold War Context. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate General Patton, the evidence should exist somewhere. Intelligence agencies, even when conducting illegal operations, maintain records, operational plans, mission reports, personnel assignments, financial records, after-action reviews. These documents might be classified, compartmentalized, hidden in archives so secure that most government officials don't know they exist. But they exist. So researchers have been searching for decades. What they've found is a pattern of systematic absence. Every document that might confirm or disprove the assassination theory is either missing, destroyed, or classified beyond reach. Patton's medical records, missing. The accident investigation report, classified, then lost. OSS operational files from December 1945, heavily redacted. Personnel records for the truck driver, non-existent. Communications between the War Department and Patton's command, incomplete. Hospital visitor logs from Heidelberg, destroyed. Even routine documents that should exist, that have no national security implications, that would normally be preserved in military archives, are gone. This creates an evidentiary void. Conspiracy theorists point to the missing documents as proof of a cover-up. If there was nothing to hide, they argue, why are so many records missing? Skeptics argue that missing records prove nothing. Documents from 1945 are often incomplete. Archives have limited space. Files are destroyed per retention schedules. Sometimes things just get lost. Both arguments have merit, but the context matters. The Cold War was beginning in December 1945. The Office of Strategic Services was transitioning to the Central Intelligence Agency. American intelligence operations were becoming more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more willing to conduct operations that violated both law and ethics in service of national security. We know this now because documents from that era have been declassified, slowly, over decades. We know about Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to America despite their war crimes. We know about MK-Ultra, which conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. We know about COINTELPRO, which surveilled and disrupted domestic political groups. We know about assassination programs targeting foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. We know American intelligence agencies were capable of murder, deception, and massive cover-ups. So when someone suggests they might have killed an inconvenient general in 1945, it's not a crazy theory. It's consistent with what we know those agencies did. The question isn't whether American intelligence agencies were capable of such an operation. The question is whether they actually conducted one. And without the evidence, we cannot know for certain. Epilogue. What if Patton had lived? The final question haunts every discussion of Patton's death. What if he had survived? What if the accident had been less severe? What if he had recovered? What if he had returned to the United States? Would George Patton have become a political figure? Would he have run for office, bringing his celebrity status and military reputation into the political arena? Would he have testified before Congress about Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements, about forced population transfers, about political purges in Eastern Europe? Would he have written a book exposing what he viewed as Allied betrayals of the peoples we claim to liberate? Would he have shaped public opinion about the emerging Cold War? We'll never know. But the fact that we ask these questions reveals something important. Patton mattered. His voice mattered. His perspective, right or wrong, represented a viewpoint that vanished from American discourse after December 1945. Some historians argue that Patton's death was fortunate for America. His aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union could have triggered a premature confrontation that would have been catastrophic. The Cold War required careful management, patient containment, strategic diplomacy. Patton would have undermined all of that. Other historians argue that Patton was right, that confronting Soviet expansion immediately, while American forces were still mobilized in Europe, would have prevented decades of Cold War conflict, that his warnings about Stalin were prescient and should have been heeded. Both arguments assume Patton would have had significant influence if he had lived, and maybe that's why he died. The last line Patton wrote in his diary, just days before the accident, reads, "History will prove me right. They just don't want to hear it yet." He never got the chance to make his case. 79 years later, the debate continues. Was his death a tragic accident? A politically convenient outcome that some officials were relieved to see? Or a calculated assassination ordered by intelligence agencies that viewed him as a threat to national security? The files remain classified. The witnesses remain silent. The medical records remain missing. And George Smith Patton Jr. remains buried in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers he commanded, his warnings unheeded, his voice silenced, his truth lost to history. Unless Douglas Bazata was telling the truth, unless somewhere, in some classified archive, the evidence exists, unless someday someone finds the files that prove what really happened on that December morning in 1945. Until then, we're left with questions, and sometimes the questions we cannot answer reveal more than the questions we can.